into the sea of mud. Filosola finally gets the orders from Santa Anna when he's on the West Bernard. He's already crossed the San Bernard. And you know what happens to him when he gets to the West Bernard? He can't cross it because the rains have come. It's been raining on him all day. And he tries to go back and cross the San Bernard, and he can't cross the San Bernard anymore now. He's trying to get to that high road to San Felipe. Even if he wanted to go back by this time to San Jacinto, too bad. He can't do it. He spends the next 10 days in pure hell. Filosola is having a lot of really bad days in late April and early May. He finally makes the crossing of the Colorado, gets back to Victoria, and immediately leaves. This is where he's been ordered, essentially. The Mexican army has been ordered to Victoria and to San Antonio. He immediately leaves, says that it's indefensible. He gets to Goliad, and he starts, he says, repairing the barracks, trying to sort of set up a line of defense there. But then there's word that the Americans, maybe 1,800 or more, are on their way. He later claims that he cooks up a plan. Send a message to Andrade, the general at San Antonio, to make a 4-day march to Goliad. In the meantime, Filosola will start south, and after 2 days, turn around, do a countermarch, and bam, the two Mexican armies arrive at Goliad at the same time. I don't see any evidence that he actually tried to put this into effect, and in any case, he says at this point, then the treaty arrived. The Treaty of Velasco, I think. The treaty that Santa Anna has worked out, or at least the further agreement with Santa Anna to cease hostilities. And he says, of course, I ceased hostilities. Well, earlier he said he's not following any orders. It's a it's a record very full of contradictions that Filosola leaves behind in explaining just why he was doing what he was doing. One of the first things he does in the immediate aftermath of San Jacinto is to send a message to the man that Texans love to hate, Juan Davis Bradburn, the Kentuckian in the Mexican army who had been involved with the disturbances in Anahuac in the early days of Texas trouble with Mexico. He sends a message to Bradburn saying that ship that's been bringing stuff up from Matamoros and that San Antonio said to bring that Santa Anna said to bring supplies to Brazoria, don't let it come to Brazoria. In fact, don't let it come north of Copano, down there south of Goliad. Don't let it come north of Copano without orders directly from me. Filosola, in talking about what happened at Goliad, amazingly says, even if his so-called battle plan had worked, and he and Andrade had sprung a surprise and a trap on the Americans, that he still would have had to retreat from Goliad to the Nueces or even the Rio Grande. Why? He said, because battles don't nourish soldiers who stand in need of every kind of provision. Well, he had 3 shiploads to arrive for him at Copano. And some of you out there know what happened to him. He had already pulled his troops from Copano, so who was waiting for the Mexican supplies when they got there to the Copano Bay? 20 Texas Rangers under Isaac Burton, the famous Horse Marines. And these guys tricked the Mexican ship or the ship that's been hired by the Mexicans to sending a boat ashore, and they go out and capture the ship. Then 2 other ships with supplies for Filosola come in, and they trick the captains to come over, and they capture those other 2. 3 ships, not exactly on the high seas, but out in the water, have been captured by 20 mounted Texas Rangers. That's pretty good. Texan control of the coast wasn't assured, however. The very fact that these 3 ships could come up around the 1st of June and land all of those supplies for the Mexican army, and remember, they were intended for the Brazos until Filosola told them not to come there, means that the Texas Navy is important, but not invincible and not ubiquitous. And speaking of boats full of supplies for the Mexicans, remember that when Houston got to Lynchburg, when Houston got to the Buffalo Bayou down by Lynch's Ferry, he found a flatboat full of supplies. And the Texans had breakfast with Santa Anna's supplies. So this is not a Mexican army totally without supplies. He says the country's a desert. When he writes that he's still waiting for the watchman, that he says not to go north of Kopano, he's already south of Kopano on the Nueces. He said that defense of Goliad was impossible because of lack of supplies, that an offense was impossible against the Texans, and so he assures the Mexican government at the end of May that he's decided to hold the Rio Grande line. The Rio Grande line. The Texans couldn't have possibly given him too much trouble as he held that Rio Grande line. And Bayer, of course, he said was useless, so he pulled them out of there. It's not till he's well down in the Trans-Nueces that he gets word saying that you're fired. And Urrea has been given command. Urrea orders Andrade, by long distance, orders Andrade to turn around and fight the Texans, and as De La Peña says, Andrade wisely turned a deaf ear to that order because there was no way in the difficult travels down across the Nueces Strip that this Mexican army, barely able to stand and without supplies, was going to turn around and fight the Texans. So in conclusion, when and how did Mexico lose Texas? Not at San Jacinto, not with all those Mexican armies so close, nor with Santa Anna's orders. It wasn't Santa Anna's orders that created the first major retrograde movements by the Mexicans. It wasn't by losing control of the Gulf. The Texans clearly were not in complete control of the Gulf. It was a loss of nerve at Mrs. Powell's Tavern. General Urrea, says De La Peña, should have moved no matter what. Orders or no orders, military discipline or no discipline, take over. And sure, there's no doubt, as Miguel suggested earlier, that Jose Urrea was a take-charge guy, and had Urrea been at Old Fort instead of Filasola, we might be looking at the Battle of San Jacinto as the way we do with some of those fabulous Confederate victories. You know, wiped out the Yankees and then pow, the Yankees wiped us right back out. Sounds like Shiloh, doesn't it? So I find that the Mar de Lodo, the Sea of Mud that Greg's about to talk to you about, might well have sealed the issue. But in my own view, I don't find any change in Filasola's behavior before and after his baptism in the Mar de Lodo, in the Sea of Mud. But here's Greg to tell you about the sea. Thanks very much. I'll leave the control here.
We will have an opportunity at the end to question Jim and Greg and Frank. So we'll continue with our program now. Our next speaker is Greg Dimmick. He is a pediatrician who resides in Wharton, Texas. He's a native of Wyoming, a graduate of Texas A&M with a postgraduate doctoral degree from the University of Nebraska. And one may ask, what in the world a pediatrician is doing at this symposium? And the answer is that Greg Dimmick has become a rather prominent amateur archaeologist and investigator of the Mexican Army, and in particularly the Mexican Army's retreat after the Battle of San Jacinto. He has a special talent for finding artifacts left behind by the retreating army, and is a member of the Houston Archaeological Society. He has 2 publications devoted to his discoveries and has given many lectures throughout Texas on this subject, but this will be his first lecture in Houston. His topic is Tracking the Mexican Army Through the Mar de Lodo, Sea of Mud. Greg?
Jim, I may need a little help with those overheads here in a second. First of all, let me say thank you for having me here today, and I really appreciate being here. I'm very impressed with this conference. I mean, I've been to several conferences, and this is really first rate. I'm very impressed with the Houston effort here. I'm Greg Dimmick. I'm from Wharton, and you San Jacinto aficionados will remember that the Wharton brothers were very active in the Texas Revolution, and John Wharton was the keenest blade at San Jacinto. I've since read a quote that he was actually declared, the 2 guys were declared as the keenest blades at San Jacinto. So I really should technically say he was a co-keenest blade at San Jacinto. Unfortunately, apparently he wasn't a great marksman because he was getting off his horse at a later age, a couple of years later, and his pistol went off and he shot himself in the stomach and died. So he was not the keenest marksman, he was the keenest blade. The Wharton brothers, our town was named after them, and they had never lived in Wharton County, and they'd never lived in Wharton, but that's regardless of the fact. I want to warn y'all that I have a passion for the Mexican Army. I really do. Obviously, to be here, I have to have a passion. My friends tell me it's an obsession. My wife tells me it's lunacy. But I love it. I'm just crazy about it. I'm going to disagree with Jim a little bit on a few issues. And you got to be kind of crazy to stand up here as a pediatrician and tell a guy who's a professor of history, well-published, a major university, tell him, nah, I don't agree with you. But I'm going to do it anyway. Luckily, I don't have a reputation that I have to withhold. My patients are going to come see me anyway. I want to talk a little bit about the Mexican Army. First of all, I think it's been forgotten. It's been poorly represented in the past. And what I'd like to say is that the Mexican Army, from the get-go, had a bad take from the Texas side. If you read the Mexican history, it's interesting. You have to take into account that there was conflict between Urrea and Filosola. So any history that you read from the Mexican side, take that into account. When you read into the Texas accounts, the early information that was written down was very poor, full of lies as far as I can tell. And then later on it got worse. And it wasn't so much that it was just lies and stretching the truth, but it was just that it was forgotten. It was basically forgotten. The first overhead, if I can get one of y'all to put it on, actually, that I was going to show you, was the picture, the cartoon. Jeff, can you put on the cartoon? This is an 1837 cartoon. And this is, Jeff found this for me. This is actually the retreating Mexican Army. This was their concept. This was drawn by a Texan, obviously, of the retreating Mexican Army. Not exactly flattering at the time. Just to give you an idea of how bad information was at the time with the Texans, you know, Ehrenberg is a good person to quote because Ehrenberg says at Fannin Battle on the 20th of March that they killed 600 Mexicans. There weren't 600 involved in the battle. So, I mean, the Mexicans were bad about exaggerating. The Texans were really bad. What I'd also like to do is now I'm going to keep you all working. Now I can take the next overhead. I'm almost done with the overheads. The map again now. We'll go back to the map. What I want to talk to you about is I'm going to try to throw you a couple of little spurs now and then, a little things that I think need to be addressed. One thing I want to really briefly put on there, I think it's the solid red overlay on that. There should be a red overlay, and stay there because I'll just put that up for just a second. Yeah, there was another one that was solid red. What I want to do is another thing that I think has been really ignored is Urrea's path north. So I'm going to throw this up here for just a second and whet y'all's appetite as to something that has really been ignored. Urrea, everybody knows that he came up and he captured Goliad. He went to Victoria. They don't realize that he crossed north of Matagorda and then came down and captured Matagorda. He came all the way up here and he went to Mrs. Powell's. We have found a campsite right here on the West Bernard River on this side where Urrea was camped. And then he went to Mrs. Powell's. Then he came down to Columbia and Brazoria. So you see all of these Texas history books, and they always show Urrea going straight up the coast. They always, you'll notice, show him going to Brazoria and then Columbia. But if you read his diary, not true at all. He was at Brazoria when he got the news. Now the next one. What I want to do is show you now the actual retreat. I've never seen a map that shows the retreat of the Mexican Army. And I can tell you this with about 90% accuracy. I will admit that we're still looking for sites. This is Urrea leaving from Brazoria in West Columbia, and this is Filosola and his troops coming from Fort Bend or Old Fort and meeting at Mrs. Powell's. They met there on the 25th. Let me say just a few brief things about that meeting. I think Jim did an excellent job. I disagree a little bit. I'm not as anti-Filosola as Jim is. I think he was fairly spineless, true. But on the other hand, I do think that his forces, not Urrea's forces, but his forces were undersupplied, and they were the dredges of the Mexican army. Yes, he had about 1,100 men, but look at the troops. The best troops were at San Jacinto. The permanent units, the preferred, even the units he had, like the Activo Mexico, the first Activo Mexico, their preferential units, their grenadiers and their cazadores, they were at San Jacinto. So the troops that he had left were pretty much the best troops had already left. Santa Anna complains that Cost didn't bring 500 good troops with him. Filosola didn't have 500 good troops to send him. He says that's why he lost, because his orders weren't carried out. Well, there weren't 500 good troops. Urrea had some good troops, but he wasn't there. Okay? So anyway, what happened is at this meeting, they got together, and my reading of the deposition, a lot of this eyewitness accounts came out of Filosola's court-martial, which, by the way, I think we should remember that he was acquitted. My reading is that Filosola doesn't want to make a decision. He has basically been out of touch of Santa Anna except for 1 week in the whole campaign. Santa Anna's had nothing to do with him. He's number 2 in charge, but I can't tell that he ever made a decision up to this point. I can't see that Santa Anna ever told him what he was going to do, what his plans were, anything. So here's Filosola all of a sudden stuck in a leadership position when he has no idea what to do. These guys that come back across the river, they tell him, hey, one of them tells him there's 800 Texans, and one of them tells him there's 1,000. One of them tells him there's 2,500 Texans. He doesn't know. He says, my maps are terrible. My scouts are worthless. I don't have anybody that knows anything about where the Texans are. He says, I'm in a terrible spot, which he was. Richmond Rosenberg's in a huge bend of the river on the Brazos. Very bad, I think, militarily. I agree with Jim that the high ground on the other side of the river is what he said he was afraid of, but he occupied that ground. So that, you can't buy that story. His troops occupied the high ground on the other side. Gayona's army was already crossing the river. Anyway, Urrea didn't stand up for whatever reason. He did not stand up. He did not argue. Ampuria actually did say, let's wait around here 3 days. Let's see if we can find Santana. But the Mexican army decided we're going to retreat. Okay? Well, what happened is they started their retreat from Mrs. Powell's. Everything was cool. As they were crossing the San Bernard River, which is right here, as they were crossing the San Bernard River near Mrs. Powell's, it started to rain. And a lot of people think of Texas as dry. Y'all here in Houston know that Texas isn't dry. I remember when I first moved to Wharton one time, we had 18 inches of rain in one day. And I'm guessing that's about what they had at this time. They said it rained and it rained and it rained. Filosola said it was like water had been poured out of pitchers onto the soldiers' heads. They had to sleep squatting. They couldn't lay down. The next day they went over to the West Bernard River right here, and right there is where they couldn't get across. That's when they finally got the orders. I absolutely agree that Filosola, there's no way Filosola was obeying Santa Anna's orders. He didn't have them till this point, and he specifically states, and I totally agree, all the others seem to agree, that they didn't change what they were doing one bit when they got those orders. Okay? One thing that is very interesting, if you read the orders tell half of the army to go to San Antonio and half of it to go to Victoria. So anybody that wants to say, oh no, they blindly obeyed the orders, well, that's not what they were told to do. They stuck together. They didn't change their idea. Interesting point. I'm absolutely convinced that one thing that Urrea did talk them into, and Filosola says this repeatedly, what Urrea did was he talked Filosola into, let's go back the exact same way I came. Urrea criticizes Filosola for the path he took, but there's no doubt in my mind Urrea is the one that talked him into it, to go in this way. This is the exact path that Urrea took north. They were just going backwards. It makes sense. That way, Philosola says, that way we could pick up our troops from Matagorda, from Goliad, from Victoria. It would be, and we can, it's easier to get supplied at Copano. So this is what happened. Now, on the banks of the 27th, they got flooded. Urrea's guide is the one that said, hey, there's another road and we can go up to Atascocita crossing. That's the crossing that they'd all used when they were except Urrea's troops, but Philosola's troops had all crossed at Atascocita following Santa Anna. So they said, we can go back there. Well, this was a big mistake, because what happened is that they backtracked here to the San Bernard, and then they headed up this way. And when they headed up northwest, right there, they got into the Mar de Lodo. And what I'd like to do is take you all in there. I hope everybody wore their boots, because it's going to get kind of muddy. The Mar de Lodo nowadays is still, all they can use it for is rice farms. It's very sandy. It's not thick mud like a lot of people would think, but it's sandy. I have friends that tell me that they used to work cattle in there and they could not ride horses in there. The rice farmers still will not take in, oops, I just turned it off. The rice farmers still will not take in these big old rice tractors, because it's so bad in there. I've been metal detecting in there a lot, and believe me, there have been times that I didn't know if I was going to get out of there. Wharton County, just to give you an idea of where we're talking about. This is, I'm going to show you a little bit of our traditional archaeology. This was at Mrs. Powell's, which, by the way, the Mexican Army was very organized. They spent a whole day there. It was not a Napoleonic retreat like from Moscow. They were very organized. They were talking about how we're going to regroup, who's going to command this. They waited a whole day, so I mean, they were in no panic. This is excavation at Mrs. Powell's. There's a lot of ceramics there. There's actually 2 home sites there. I wanted to stick in a few of the ceramics there that we found at Mrs. Powell's. It's amazing to me that the old stuff is the prettiest. If you find Civil War stuff, it's all white and ugly, but this is nice stuff. These we think were like butter plates or something like that. Now, these were not necessarily from Mrs. Powell's. Remember, there was a later occupation of that site, probably from about 1840 to about 1855, 1860. What I want to do is go through and talk about a few of the things we found. And the first thing I want to talk about is munitions. These are really, really nice. It's really handy that the Mexican Army used 75 caliber muskets. Their 75 caliber musket would shoot about a 70, 72 caliber lead ball. This is very nice because the Texans didn't use anything this big. So when we find these big old musket balls, we know we're on Mexican Army. There's a slight chance that the Texans had a few captured muskets, but they wouldn't have used them in the quantity we find them. Most people ask me, why are they white? That's oxidation. The lead turns white. We found something that I'm not aware that anybody's ever found before, and it's interesting because De La Peña talks about it. He says that their botes de metralla, their cans of canister, were so muddy that you couldn't even see them. We found approximately 3 canisters that had been dropped whole. And this is the archaeological excavation. You can see the lead balls in there, the canister. And then I'm going to show you here. This is the shot from it. You can see how big it is. What they would do is take basically a tin can, fill it up with about 50 of these lead balls, put a wooden plug in it, and a sabot, and then they put that in their cannon and make a shotgun out of their cannon. They used that quite a bit more. In fact, that's probably what they used at San Jacinto was canister, but it was probably brass. This is lead canister. That's all we found at first, but since then we found almost all brass canister. You can see now the actual outline of the tin can. See the metal around the edge? And we actually even found pieces of wood of the sabot. I'm embarrassed as an Aggie to say we sent them off to be evaluated at A&M, and apparently they've been lost. Dumb Aggies, huh? This is a solid shot cannonball. This is an iron cannonball. The more I've investigated, the more I've figured out. I don't think anybody knew whether those cannons were 6-pounders or 4-pounders or 8-pounders. I know what the Mexicans said they had. I know what the Texans said the Mexicans had. And it's amazingly confusing to me. One of the problems is that Spanish pound is not equal to an English pound. and so you can't use that. So you have to go by diameter of the bore of the cannon. And I've seen so many different cannons called 4-pounders that had a bigger diameter bore than a 6-pounder. To me, it doesn't make any sense at all. I would call this a 6-pound cannonball. It's solid, it's iron. You can see the iron rusts. This we were really shocked to find. This is a howitzer shell, and it's a 7 pulgado, which is a 6.5-inch howitzer shell. And it's hollow, and it's made of bronze or brass, if you will. It's packed full of gunpowder, and a fuse is put in it. When they shoot it, like they did at the Alamo, by the way, that was the first, when the Texans made their first shot from their 16 or 18-pounder, that was their initial reaction. The Mexicans immediately set up 2 of these howitzers and lobbed 4 of these exploding shells back at them. So that shot did not go unanswered. They put these exploding shells on them. These things, when they fire, the fuse automatically lights. The fuse is wooden, and I'm going to show you a fuse here. But then it'll explode. The first one I ever found, you can imagine how happy I was. I was about a mile from my Jeep. This thing weighs 26 pounds. I toted it back. Until the next day, I didn't even notice how sore I was. But we were thrilled to death when we found that. Well, we had a problem. It was still full of gunpowder, and it still had its fuse in it. Now, we knew that Civil War shells could be dangerous, but nobody had ever found a Mexican Army Texas Revolution shell with gunpowder in it. In fact, nobody ever really knew that they existed at the time. So we had a problem. We called several different experts and archaeologists. One of my experts that I called said, no problem, that gunpowder's worthless, it's not dangerous. The next one said, big problem, could be very dangerous. We called up the State Archaeological Society. Finally, the final word came down, call the U.S. Army. My dad was in the U.S. Army, and I knew this was a bad idea. We called the U.S. Army, and they said, don't move the thing. Well, it was in my garage, and I wasn't having the bomb squad come down to my garage and let the neighbors see them tolling out explosives out of my garage. So we took it out in the country where it would only bother the cows. They came down, they took out the fuse, said we can't get the gunpowder out of it, packed it full of plastic explosives, at the time the only one known to exist, and they blew it to smithereens. This is what's left of our first howitzer shell, and unfortunately it was one of the best ones as far as the mark. I forgot to point out the mark. This was fascinating. It had these marks on them, and they were like 4 of the 6 that we found had marks on them, and they were all different, and nobody's been able to tell us what it is. We've had the British Aero manufacturing marks, how much gunpowder was in it, which gun it was for. We still can't find anybody that's aware of why those marks would have been there or what they meant. We actually went out and put this one back together as well as we could. This is the fuse hole. This is what the fuse went in, and here's an actual fuse. This wood survived because there's so much mud. Now, they were hollow. They're hollow, and the gunpowder went all the way through there. They had a covering on them, and they had string tied around the covering. So we've got Mexican Army string. I would dare anybody else to say that they can claim the same thing. One other interesting, this is gunpowder. This is another thing we have that most people don't have. We have actual Mexican Army gunpowder. The next 5 shells that we found, we said, well, we're not calling the Army. So we took them to the car wash, and we put the nozzle of the car wash down inside and washed them out. We collected the gunpowder, and we dried it, and we took a little bit of that gunpowder, and we lit the paper on fire that it was on, and everything burned except the gunpowder. So we decided it's no longer dangerous. One other interesting thing about these howitzer shells, archaeologically, this is one of the rare instances where how we found this stuff was significant. 6 of these shells were found. 3 of them were in one spot, 2 of them were in another. Now, the 3 that we found and the 2 that we found, they were all fused. In fact, all 6 were fused. They were vertical. They were one on top of the other. What's that tell us? They were buried. Nothing in nature randomly lands up stacked on top of each other. Our theory is when the Mexican armies was approached by the Texans, which by the way they were, Juan Seguin Carnes, Burleson, they came upon the Texans from the rear on about May 2nd, May 3rd. And there was a lot of letters back and forth, like, don't mess with us. And the other side was saying, hey, we're not here. We just want to get our stuff. But the Mexicans apparently fused some howitzer shells at that time. And they were ready in case there was a fight. Well, as they pulled out, our theory is they buried them. They didn't want the Texans to get them. And they sure didn't want to travel with them fused. So they just buried them. This is written on. And what does it say? It says Barnett's, London. Well, these were English muskets. And sure enough, we emailed some experts in England, and they said, oh, yes, we were able to track down, there was a gun manufacturer, a private one, by the way, because they still say, hey, we didn't sell muskets to the government didn't sell muskets to the Mexican army. It's like they're still worried we might accuse them of something. But this was a private company that sold these muskets to the Mexicans. And sure enough, there was a Barnett's. We were shocked that there was any writing left on them. I wanted to show you this picture to give you an idea, because I'm going to show you some uniform pieces, and I want you to know what kind of stuff they had on their uniforms. I especially want to point out these hats, these shakos, to you, and I want to point out the pom-poms with a little, this is a cockade right here, this little circle, but they had really fancy uniforms. These are belt plates. See these? One of these held their bayonet, and the other one held their cartridge box. And these are belt plates right there. I've got a sample of a belt plate, and I think we've got a shako plate that would go right here, and we've got, I think, a cockade. Which, by the way, there are some new things towards the end of this, so don't anybody go to sleep that's already heard my talk. We found some new stuff. I've got one item towards the end of the talk here that's been out of the ground about a month, and we don't know what it is, and we're hoping somebody can tell us one of these days what it is. I always like to tell people that I hope they don't think that I don't like the Texas Army. I have nothing against the Texas Army. The Mexican Army had just a lot better stuff. They had cool stuff. Archaeologically, the Texas Army, it's like, that's boring. This is a good example. I'm going to mix in a few unknowns here. This is an interesting item. It's very much the size and shape of a belt plate, of a chest plate that would connect those the straps. And the back attachments are very much like that. But Kevin Young, this artifact, by the way, and a lot of these others that I'm showing you are on display at the Alamo. If you make it to the Alamo, go to the gift shop. A lot of these items that you're seeing today, I don't want you all to think that all this stuff is in a box in somebody's house somewhere. A lot of the best stuff's at the Alamo. This one is, and there were some Napoleonic war type experts. I don't know if they were from France or from America. Kevin had them look at this thing. They said, oh yeah, that's a cockade, like would go up there to hold the pom-pom on. But our problem is, just recently, and I think y'all are the first one to see this picture, I found something that we found in Mexico in several sites that we think are really cockades. Now, maybe the last one was for a big officer or a different type hat or something like that. But we found several of these in Mexico. Well, we finally found one recently here in our site. So we can tell that, yes, Alamo period soldiers in the Mexican Army did use these, and we believe it's really thin. The other one's thick and heavy. This makes more sense to me. You're not going to put a big old thick heavy cockade up there to hold that pom-pom. I believe this is truly a cockade. The other one, I still don't know. This is an interesting story. When we first found this one site, we went out and did it archaeologically, and we went out and we took all the artifacts and we bagged them and we labeled their location and everything, and we found this part. It was in a bag labeled piece of an old tin can. And we cleaned it up, and it says BN1, Battalion 1. And that was fascinating to us. One of the problems that we had is the Mexican Army, Alamo period, Mexican battalions were not numbered. They were named. So this is not Alamo period. Obviously, it's a surplus item. Pre-1832. 1832, they quit numbering. It makes sense to me that, in fact, we found more surplus stuff than we have new. It makes sense to me that a lot of their Activo units, their National Guard units, if you will, didn't have the new stuff like the permanent troops did. Their Permanente troops were more like their regular army. And they had several that are activo units, which we would consider more like National Guard. Well, they got the hand-me-downs. Now, we don't know for sure that this is a shako plate. For a shako, a lot of our expert thinks it's a little too big and a little too thick, so they think it might have gone on an ammo pouch. After the next big rain, I went out and I was looking around to make sure we didn't miss anything, and I found the bottom half of this laying out on the top of the ground. It says Granaderos. This was BN1 Granaderos, the Grenadier. They were the veteran troops. It's interesting, they got paid, I think, 6 pesos a month instead of 5, and the veteran troops were always kept in the rear. And everybody says it was 2 purposes. Number 1 is you commit your best troops last. Number 2 is the best troops make sure the weakest troops don't retreat. You've got the best troops to stimulate the weak ones to keep fighting. But Battalion 1 Granaderos, I love that they ran out of room and had to put the Ros on the end. That when we first found that, we were trying to figure out what those 2 words were. This is a crossbelt plate. And we've actually found 2 of these. I had the luck of actually finding both of them myself. This, as far as I know, no other ones like this exist. Almost all of them are oval. Well, we found these that were rectangular, but the corners were clipped. And they have this fancy M on them. We've had a lot of fun arguing with all the different people about what this M could be. The problem is there was a battalion Matamoros, there was a battalion Morelos, there was Permanente, or there was the Primero Mexico. Some people argue that this fancy scroll over the top of it, I hope you can see that, is not a scroll but a P. So this is PM. So they think, well, it could have been Primero Mexico. Well, that's fine, but the other 2, the Matamoros and the Morelos, they were Permanente Matamoros and Permanente Morelos. I argue for Morelos. I don't think that Primero Mexico, first of all, I don't think that's a P, because I found some handwritten documents, the San Luis Battalion, where they put that scroll above their M. So I've seen that. So I think that that scroll is just for effect. It looks great. That's brass. Brass, bronze, gunmetal, whatever you want to call it. It turns green, by the way. Anything that's brass is going to turn green. Anything that's lead is going to turn white. The iron rust. So I don't think that's a P personally. But the Matamoros, they were at San Jacinto. So we found 2 of them. The odds of 2 of their soldiers escaping from San Jacinto, making it back to the retreating Mexican army, and both of them losing their chest plates is pretty low. So I don't think it's Matamoros. I don't think it's Primero Mexico, because I don't think that's a P, and I doubt that they were an activo unit. I doubt that they had the newest stuff. So that leaves us with Morelos. Morelos was in the retreat, and they were one of the larger units in the retreat. This was found at Mrs. Powell's, and this will give you a good example how archaeologists actually can benefit from research. I have been lucky enough to have the deposition. I didn't know Jeff had found it. Everything I found it. He found it before I did, but I didn't know him. He could have saved me a lot of trouble if he'd just gotten a hold of me and let me know he had all this stuff. But we found the deposition. Kevin Young got me the first part of it, and we went in there and started reading the depositions, and one of them, Jim talked about today, one of the officers that was under Urrea. He mentioned a fact that was interesting to us. He said when we got to Mrs. Powell's, we got Filosola upset because we camped on the other side of the river. We had no clue to go over to the other side of the river and look for artifacts. Well, we went over there and found a better campsite on the other side of the river than we ever had found on this side, and we found some amazing stuff. This is the insignia of one of the cazadores, if you will, light infantry. Some of them probably had Baker rifles. They were more marksmen. The other side of Turkey Creek, not the San Bernard. This is another thing we found there, that same place. This is an exploding bomb. This is the insignia of their grenadier troops. So the flaming bomb. This made a lot of guys really drool. They love those flaming bombs. We found some interesting buttons. This one, it looks like a J. It's not, it's a 1. They're ones at that time, they loved to put a little curly deal at the bottom of it. This is a 1. So once again, probably a surplus item, because it would be the 1st Battalion. One of the problems is it could have been surplus 1st Regiment Cavalry. That's hard to say, but it's tough tracking those and finding out which unit might have gotten the surplus. But I'm going to show you one other one that we actually have a theory. These are 6 buttons, and one of them's big and one of them's small. These 2 were actually found there across the creek at Mrs. Powell's as well, but we found them at other sites. We probably found 6 or 8 of these. So it's one of the more common, it's by far the most common numbered. We've only found 6s and 1s. We found 2 1s and about 6 or 7 6s. I have a theory. Manuel Hinojosa from the Valley is a big Mexican Army guy, and he really knows his stuff. He tells me that the Aldama Battalion used to be the 6th Battalion before they were named the Aldama, and that they were from Mexico City. Well, the Primero Activo Mexico was also from Mexico City, and in my mind, I see them getting their new stuff, the Aldama getting their new stuff, and passing down their hand-me-downs to the Activo. And the Activo Mexico was in the retreat, so that's a theory. But it's interesting to talk about that kind of stuff. It's one of the reasons I'm really hoping someday we're going to get, and believe me, it's being discussed, and I'm real excited about it. But the archaeology at San Jacinto could be just like awesome, because a lot of these questions could be answered. Here is this is actually a cast of a button. The button was kind of hard to see, and we had somebody that does these things make a cast of this button, and it's great. It says República Mexicana, and on the back it said Libertad en la ley, liberty and freedom in the law, in 1828. Their buttons, these eagle buttons, were very much like their coins. If you check their coin from that period, their buttons, their uniform buttons will be almost exactly the same. These are called bullet buttons, just interesting. We even found some of them that had wood inside of them, so they sometimes put wood in them to give them more stability, I assume. We found a fair number of coins. I thought that was interesting. I don't think I've shown these before, so I wanted to show people some coins. I think this is a half real, and it's really interesting to me to see the hole in it. That's fascinating to me. Now, I've seen places that said that the soldados, the soldiers, would sew them into their pockets so they didn't lose the coins, because money was very rare. Any of you that think that you have a cannon full of gold in your town that's full of Mexican Army gold, which to me, every town in Texas that I've ever talked to the people, there's a cannon of Mexican Army gold somewhere in the creek near their town. It's not there. The Mexican Army didn't have much money. You got to remember, Mexico gained their independence in 1821. I mean, they're not exactly an established power. They've just been in several insurrections. They're not a rich country by any means, so they don't have a lot of money. They had a moderate amount of silver. It's fascinating to me. It sounds like half of it disappeared at San Jacinto. I don't know how much was originally found, but something like 8,000 pesos or something was finally turned in. But another thing that interests me as a physician, I trained in San Antonio, and a lot of my Hispanic patients would come in with little charms. And one of them was a little thing that's some kind of nut or something that they call it a deer's eye. But the other one they'd almost always have a dime with a hole punched through it, and they're wearing it around their neck. So it's fascinating to me to wonder if that tradition of this being a health charm reaches all the way back to this period. Here's another coin. Unfortunately, you can't hardly see anything on it, but I still wanted to put it in there. I thought that you real buffs of Mexican history would be interested, because this coin's from Zacatecas. And this Zacatecas coin, for those of you that really know your stuff, the Santa Anna had just finished putting down a rebellion in Zacatecas. Interestingly enough, and it's fascinating to me just how history is, there were countless more people got killed in that campaign than the Texas campaign. It was much bloodier, the Zacatecas campaign. And that's where they just come from, and I think it's really fascinating that here we find this coin from Zacatecas. Here's another coin that we can't explain, and don't ask, I'm not a coin person, don't ask me. In fact, this has only been out of the ground about a month. This is about a 1750, 1760 French coin. I know that Manuel Hinojosa told me one time he found a Roman coin at a Mexican army site. And I'm talking about ancient Rome. I'm not talking about, like period, ancient Rome. So it's very interesting to me that we see that these guys, whatever they had for money, they would use it. Here's a French coin. It's just whatever you can come up with. This, I was talking to somebody and they said they had some stirrups. This is a piece of a stirrup. This is brass, and I had to lay it down so I could get a good picture of it, so unfortunately you can't tell. But this would be the side of the stirrup, and this would be right before the base. The base would have attached right here. It's broken off. We actually found two sides, and these would have gone up. This is the top of the stirrup. This is the bottom of the side of the stirrup. This whole thing is a side, and we found both sides. This is one of the things we found at the Urrea site. The reason I feel comfortable it's an Urrea site is because it's on the west side of the West Bernard River. And if you remember, the Mexican army couldn't get across the West Bernard River when they were retreating. So they got stuck on the east side. They never made it to the west side, yet we found a bunch of stuff on the west side. So I think it's got to be an Urrea site, and it's got to be an advanced site. It can't be a retreat site. This is a spur that we found directly across from that site. This is the spur that was supposed to lead us to the campsite of April 27th, where the Mexican army camped the night that they couldn't get across. Unfortunately, so far it hasn't worked, and I can't tell you how many countless hours we've spent out there in the neighborhood of this spur. We found this spur and one musket ball across the creek from that Urrea site. Our thinking is, if they're taking the exact same path back that Urrea took forward, and he was camped across the creek right here, there's got to be a Mexican army camp from the retreating Mexican army directly across the creek. And it's a great idea, we just can't find it. When you put a metal detector that's got a head about 6 inches in diameter and you put a guy with one of those into a 600-acre rice field, it's pretty much hit and miss, let me tell you. This is the spur. The only reason I put this spur in here is because this is the one, if anybody got to see the thing on PBS, the De La Peña, the show, what's the guy's name from Rice that did it? Brian Huberman. Brian Huberman's film, he did a great job. Very interesting deal on De La Peña. He filmed me out there in the mud looking like my pants were about to fall off and everything else. But I showed him this spur, and I was teasing, and I told him that I love to get at the historians with this spur, because De La Peña in his diary says he lost his spurs and then he lost his boots and had to proceed barefoot. And I always tell him that this is De La Peña's spur. If he just had a name on it, it would have helped. This is an interesting artifact that we find that's really nice, because this is something that the Mexican army used at that period that apparently nobody else in Texas did at that time. I've talked to a lot of historical archaeologists, and they say they never find horseshoes like this. They're probably mule shoes, but they could be horseshoes. But you can see they're the old European style. I had a woman, a young lady, came up to me one time and said she did her doctorate or something on horseshoes of Europe. And she said this is classic European horseshoe. And this is what the Mexican army was using, because we found a bunch of these. We found a lot of them with the nails still in them. Somebody had told me that the nails still in them mean that the mule died with the shoe on, and I've been corrected, and people have told me you shouldn't have said that. In fact, I was on the History Channel saying that. Now I've been corrected saying, hey, they could have thrown the shoe and the nails would still be in them. So I'm not going to say that anymore. This is another interesting little item that we don't know what the heck it is. We found this at Mrs. Powell's, but not across the creek. We found it in the main Mexican Army line at Mrs. Powell's. And we really don't know what this is. We found a candlestick, and I'm sometimes thinking that this could be a piece of a candlestick, but I'm not at all convinced it is. It's brass. It's just not quite as green. Some of the brass, depending on the soil conditions, looks a little redder. This is the piece I was telling you about. I'm going to show you two views. Here's the view from the top, and here's the view from the bottom. It's hollow, and I don't know if you can see it. There's a little iron connector right there, and there's another one on this side. That's only been out of the ground, about a little over, I'd say 2 weeks, and we have no clue what it is. We thought, first thing that came into my mind, I was a Boy Scout, and I thought tent pole. That's a cover for a tent pole, and the grommet would fit right over there, but that thing seems a little short. It does stick out, but seems a little short. It could have been just covering a piece of a log on a wagon or something like that. But this, to me, is what makes this all fascinating, is we keep finding all this stuff that, I mean, it's just been forgotten. This is an interesting piece. When we found this, we said, man, a knife handle. I was going around showing everybody I found a knife handle. Once again, my buddy from the valley told me, he said, that's not a knife handle, that's a cane handle. And sure enough, it is. So we started looking at some pictures of some old canes. The Mexican Army loved canes. Their officers, their sergeants, they loved to use them to induce their soldiers to move a little faster. I think some of the accounts at Goliad, they were talking about how they were whapping their soldiers to get them to attack again. But once again, even with, I assume this probably wasn't some big-time officer's cane, but you can still, they still made this nice effort to decorate and make it look fancy. This is another interesting little thing. We found it and we thought, that looks like a dog's head. First of all, interestingly enough, I think it's pewter. I don't think it's brass or bronze. There are pewter buttons from the period, so we know they had pewter. But it's an eagle. Whoops. I knew I'd do that sooner or later. It's an eagle. There's the eye, and here's the beak right here. And it's broken off here. We don't know if that could have gone. I don't see them putting pewter on a sword hilt or something like that. Maybe a flagpole, something like that. Once again, one of these things that's going to be real interesting, hopefully someday, to find out what it is. This is a real fascinating item to me. This we found in Urrea's campsite, and it's a wax stamp. It's a backwards G. Now, it's fascinating to me. I immediately got all my stuff out, looked up every officer I could find that served under Urrea. I could only find one whose last name started with G, Francisco Garay. He's kind of famous because Filosola and Urrea argue about him because he was sent ahead to get the pass on the Colorado where they thought they were going to cross when they were retreating. Well, he left a day early, so he didn't get flooded, and he made it all the way down there. And he was down there waiting for him for a week before they finally told him, we'll go on to Victoria. But Garay went on ahead. And he also, we have little fragments of his diary. He had a diary. There's a little fragment of it here and there. Urrea has a fragment. Filosola has a fragment where they quote his diary. Someday I'd love to find his diary. And wouldn't it be nice if it was stamped with a piece of wax with that G? This is an interesting little piece that I've never shown anybody before. This is a little a hook that would go on their brush. From that belt plate, I forgot to show you from that cross belt plate, the fancy M, it had a little hole at the bottom of it. I don't know if you noticed that. But from that hole would hang a chain. And on the chain there was a pick and a brush. Well, this was the brass tip of the brush. The ones we found had wood in them, so they used a little wooden plug to hold the horsehair in there to make a brush. And what they would do is when they'd fired their muskets a couple of times, it would get clogged with gunpowder. They'd take the pick and they'd clean out the fire hole that led from the pan to the barrel. And then they'd brush it all off. So the pick and the brush, this is the tip of the brush. Interesting, just to me it's fascinating where things come from. If you shoot your musket and the fire hole's plugged, the gunpowder in the pan will go off, but the gunpowder in the barrel won't go off and nothing happens. That's a flash in the pan. This is a neat little item. I like to tell the story of how we found this to show you how bad archaeologists are at metal detecting. And believe me, we were bad when we started. We've gotten good now. But we were bad when we started. We had a flag by this artifact. It was still in the ground, and we didn't know what was in the ground. We just knew that we had gotten a reading at that point. And so they put a flag at that point. Well, these guys come back later. We were going to dig them, identify them, put them in the bag, and mark them. These guys that come back later told me there's nothing in this flag because they had a different metal detector than I did. They said, we checked this when there's nothing here. So I checked it with mine, and we found this. We would have missed it if we'd believed the archaeology metal detectors. This is an interesting item. We don't know what it is. We think possibly from a belt buckle, maybe an epaulette, but it's really interesting. We're not sure it's brass. I think it might be yellow silver, and the eagle is facing the wrong direction. if any of you are experts in Mexican eagle coinage or buttons, after 1821, the eagle faced the other way. So this is an old item. So we're thinking an officer, something like that. Every button and coin that we could find after 1821, the eagle faced to our right. These are a couple of interesting little pieces that I've not shown before. We just found these recently. They were in our last publication, but they've not. I don't think I've ever had this slide for a talk. We're arguing with the experts on this one. What I told them that I believe this is collar insignia. Little brass letter. It's a P, and I think either part of a B or an M or something like that. It could be Battalion Permanente, or it could be Permanente Moralis or something like that. They've got little connectors. You can't hardly see them, but they're little connectors on the back like they would be. Here's one, and there's a connector right there. But that's definitely a P, and it's broken off there, so something, I think another letter was connected to it. Until we found this, everybody thought that all the Mexican Army uniforms were embroidered. The collar insignia were embroidered. And I think we can tell them now, unless they can tell us what these things are, we can at least argue that no, they had actual brass insignia. That is all of my slides, and I think I still have just a couple more minutes. So I want to talk about one other little interesting thing that I just recently found out. It seems like the more I get into this, the more I find out and the more questions I have. We've actually been looking into some stuff, and we found an account of a Goliad survivor. Those Goliad survivors, they got around. They were running around. This guy, as I recall, his name was Samuel T. Brown, and he was in Ward's unit. They were the Georgia unit, and they came, and they were not actually in the battle with Fannin. They escaped from Refugio and then got recaptured at Victoria, and they were in the, I don't know whether to say massacre or execution. Massacution. This guy escaped. Samuel Brown escaped from being killed. And he was, there were 4 of them. And he actually was recaptured, he says, on April 20th near the Brazos. Well, they took him to Fort Bend, and they took him to Filisola's army. And I had never read the end of this account, and come to find out, he was with the retreating Mexican army. So he went, he says well, first of all, he said his boots were stolen from him, and that he had to go barefoot, he said, through knee-deep mud. And he said it rained on his head in torrents pretty near all the time, during the whole time walking through the prairie. Interestingly enough, he says he was one of several Texas prisoners. He said he can remember the name of 3. He said there was a Leach from England, and a Johnson from New York, and Simpson. And I asked my buddies, and Jeff came up with one of the answers for me, and I just got to believe he's right. There was a William Simpson that was captured at San Felipe when the Mexican army, there was Isaac Hill gave one of the accounts. Isaac Hill says Simpson was in the garden looking for vegetables. When the Mexican army surprised him early in the morning, he and the other guy got away, and Simpson got captured. Well, that makes perfect sense, because that's exactly, then those troops went on to Fort Bend, and Simpson would have been with them. So we know there were Texas prisoners in the marching through the Mar de Lodo. One other thing, I keep remembering all this stuff I forgot to mention. One other thing I want to make sure that you understand, we're talking about 2,500 troops. There were about 1,500 others that weren't in the retreating Mexican army, but they were in Texas. So we're talking about 4,000 Mexican troops in Texas, about 2,500 of them in the withdrawal, if you will. I'm not sure it was a retreat. But besides the 2,500 troops, they had 8 pieces of artillery. They had 120 wagons. They probably had anywhere from 1,200 to 1,500 mules. And probably one of the toughest things, and Jim probably should have mentioned this as maybe a factor in Filisola's decision, they probably had around 1,500 females with them, camp followers, soldaderas. Filisola called them non-essential personnel. De La Peña, I think, called them fleas or leeches or something along that line. So But this had to be a big burden. You know, we're talking now about like 4,000 people moving through one of the worst areas. So to conclude, I would like to say a couple of things. First of all, it's a miracle in my mind that the Mexican army was able to take all of those people and get through that area. I can't believe they didn't just leave the artillery, give it up. Urrea said Filasola wanted to. Filasola said he didn't, but they didn't. They got everything back. It's a miracle. They did lose a few wagons, but they didn't. As far as we know, they didn't lose any cannons. Some of the Texans said they buried a cannon or two. We've not been able to find them. We'd love to. But anyway, to me, it's a miracle that they were able to do it. They were tough. They were tough as nails to be able to get through that mess. Second point, what I like to say, as far as the overall campaign, my attitude is San Jacinto was strike one. When they met at Mrs. Powell's, they still had options. Then they got stuck in the Mar de Lodo. That was strike two. After they got out of the Mar de Lodo, I don't think they had any options. I don't think there was any way that they were able to attack after that. They were physically whipped, and they left half their stuff there in the mud. We're finding it still. No telling how much the Texans picked up, which, by the way, they said they did. One of the guys complained. He said all we had to do was go pick up. We were bored. All we could do is go pick up all the stuff the Mexicans dropped. And then, to me, strike three, the thing that really was the final blow was the pastry war, so Urrea couldn't come back. Urrea was building up another army. He was ready to come back and re-invade, and with his aggressive nature, who knows? Maybe they would have had a chance, but they got tied up with this ugly little thing with France and never got distracted and never re-invaded. So that's, to me, the three strikes. We're going to be around for questions afterwards. I would love for anybody that knows of any possible Texas or Mexican Army artifacts or anything anywhere. We're always looking. We're always interested in information. We do have two publications, and they can be gotten through the Houston Archaeological Society. Joe Hudgens. If anybody of you know Joe, he's Mr. Archaeology in our area, and he's been like the main writer on these things. I don't want to take all the credit. Joe Hudgens has been just as important or more than I have been. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. It's absolutely incredible how much we don't know about the San Jacinto campaign, and I think we're certainly learning an awful lot today. Our final presentation is by Frank Thompson, who is an author and filmmaker and film historian who currently lives in Burbank, California. He's published 13 books, mostly on film history, including a definitive book on Alamo movies. And as Greg pointed out, he pointed out an early woodcut from 1837 of how the Americans viewed the Mexicans and the Mexican retreat. Obviously, the 20th century, with all of the Hollywood movies, there actually were about 7 or so movies that portrayed the Battle of San Jacinto. This is the first time, I believe, ever, that anybody has taken a look solely at the San Jacinto sequences, mostly in these Alamo movies, and tried to put them together and give the story of how we've perceived, how the public has perceived the Battle of San Jacinto in the 20th century. So we're going to get not only a perspective of how Americans viewed the Mexican side, but also, to end our program, we're going to get a little bit of perspective on how Hollywood portrayed the Texan side as well. So please join me in welcoming Frank Thompson.
I'm also going to need a little bit of audiovisual help because I've got 2 different clips to show you, which I hope you'll find amusing and illuminating, perhaps not in that order. We've heard the term cutting edge. Jim used it earlier today, and I think all 3 of my colleagues have shown that cutting edge research, historical research. Hollywood isn't interested in cutting edge. Hollywood doesn't particularly care about new perspectives. When it deals with historical subjects, it's always more concerned with myth, with shared perceptions, common beliefs. It's history to Hollywood is less important for what happened than what we want to think happened. And that goes for just about any historical event ever filmed. There's nothing particularly wrong with this way of looking at things, as far as I can tell. Only a fool would look to a movie for actual history. What they do is give us perspectives, a window into the event that sometimes, in some ways, can be as meaningful as anything else that we learn about it. Certainly songs and poems and epics have been written and performed about historical events since the dawn of time. And like those things, movies help us to celebrate the things we admire and to look at the heights to which we can aspire. They're not necessarily realistic, but they reach to the heart of things in some ways. Movies are great at exploring big, simple emotions. They're less effective in looking at the nuances or the facets of history, and especially an event like the Battle of San Jacinto is a very complex event, and looked at from any different angle, it becomes something else. As I think all three of my previous friends here have shown us slightly different ways of coming at it, and have come to slightly different conclusions along the way. The Texas Revolution in movies is like the Texas Revolution in the popular imagination. That is, it's a righteous fight against tyranny. And I'm sure that many, if not most of us in this room, don't exactly see it that way today. The movies have never been really good at showing anything from a Mexican perspective, simply because, as far as I can tell, no Mexican filmmakers ever approached the event at all. So it's only been Hollywood films that has looked at it. Now, Hollywood films have been much more even-handed about the subject than you might think. With only one or two exceptions, very, very early on, the Mexican army is always presented as a noble, disciplined, powerful army, and a brave army. It's only Santana who is usually depicted as the villain, and in at least one film, he actually twirls his mustache. So, in the actual Texas Revolution, the Battle of San Jacinto was an important victory for Texas after a string of defeats, and of course, as we know, it was fueled by the memories of those defeats. Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. The perfect rallying cry, and also were the ideas that started turning those things into mythic events that we could tell and retell in popular ways. But in the movies, San Jacinto is always an act of revenge. It never has much to do with anything else except avenging mostly the Alamo, and to a much lesser degree in much more recent films, Goliad. Goliad's never mentioned until 1986 in a film, as far as I can tell. What I want to show you first is a little bit of film history archaeology that I did. The very first film about San Jacinto is also the very first film about the Battle of the Alamo. It's called The Immortal Alamo, and it was made in San Antonio in March of 1911. Used 100 cadets from the Peacock Military Academy to play Santana's army, and it was made by the Méliès Star Film Company, which was down in San Antonio for a year from New York. The film, like about 90% of all films made before 1930, is gone. But I was able to locate enough stills from the film to actually recreate the story arc, and I invented title cards just logically how they would have appeared at the time. But this lasts about 5 minutes, but it'll give you the very first depiction of San Jacinto on film, and I think you'll find it interesting. So it turns out
With Davy
that they're
Crockett
all
at the
wrong.
fall of the
Well, that's
Alamo
me.
was
I'm hearing myself. All my colleagues seem to be wrong because it turns out the Battle of San Jacinto was to save Mrs. Dickinson. So there. I guess you notice she's called Lucy in this for reasons that nobody quite knows. It's not exactly ripped from the pages of history, but like all movies, it brought history alive to its audiences originally. And subsequent movies about San Jacinto didn't take quite as many liberties with the story as this one did, but each had a varied approach. And usually, the variance in the way they did things had to do with the way Sam Houston is presented. In the earliest surviving films, Martyrs of the Alamo in 1915 and Heroes of the Alamo from 1937, Houston's almost a peripheral character. He just waits, grim and resolute on the sidelines, waiting for the massacre of the Alamo to inspire his men to seek vengeance and to take matters into their own hands. Richard Dix, in a 1939 film called Man of Conquest, which you'll see a little bit of, is a Houston with a mission. He longs to retire from public life to live among the Indians that he loves, or to live with the woman that he loves even more. And she's played by the sumptuous Gail Patrick, who I would love to live with too. But his sense of duty is too strong. He's also a very humorless Houston, as they all are. It's interesting. None of the Houstons in the movies have much of a personality. But also Richard Dix's Houston is working under the express orders of Andrew Jackson to bring Texas into the United States, who has actually been sent to Texas with that aim to bring it into the United States. Sam Elliott in Gone to Texas, also known as Houston, the Legend of Texas, is the perfect sesquicentennial Houston. He's a rock of moral authority, no-nonsense figure of stern resolve, who nonetheless carries with him a great deal of personal demons, as people of our generation must have. There's a certain controversy among historians, we've heard a little bit about it today, what exactly Houston was up to when he was heading towards San Jacinto. Some people believe that he was running for the Louisiana border to seek safety, and that only at the insistence of his men did he turn and fight when he did. Others, more charitably, believe that he was cleverly luring Santa Anna into just the right spot for him to turn and attack. And naturally enough, that's the way that all the movies present it. He can be a troubled man, and almost always is. He could even be a half-crazed zealot, which is like Tom Skerritt plays him in Two for Texas. He plays him sort of like a weird evangelist with an Amish beard. But he's never less than 100% American hero. Santana, on the other hand, is never a hero of any kind. It's interesting, all the movies treat the Mexican army, as I said, very well almost, but none of the movies treat Santana very well, with the exception of The Alamo 13 Days to Glory, in which Raul Julia plays a fairly full-dimensional Santana, but since that has nothing to do with San Jacinto, we'll talk no more about it. In more recent films like Two for Texas and James A. Michener's Texas, which could be the most god-awful film ever made, those films make sure they have honorable Mexican protagonists even on the other side, and make sure that we know them and admire them. But even in those films, Santana is pretty much a wash. That's true almost from the beginning. We can't tell how or even if Santana was depicted in the Immortal Alamo, because we only have a few stills and some tests, so we really don't know. But in the first surviving film, Walter Long plays Santana as a cruel, dim-witted despot. In fact, one of the titles, I want to get this exactly here, describes him as an inveterate drug fiend noted for his shameful orgies. And his entire army is made up of drunken soldiers whose biggest sin seems to be flirting with white women. And so the Texas Revolution pretty much hinges on that in Martyrs of the Alamo. The fact that Martyrs was supervised, or what we would say now produced, by D.W. Griffith only a few months after he finished making Birth of a Nation helps us put those racial attitudes into some perspective, I think. the Santa Anas of Heroes of the Alamo and Man of Conquest of the 30s are cruel men. C. Henry Gordon actually is the one who actually twists his mustache at one point. Just before they attack the Alamo, he says, let's give these rebels something to remember. See, that's irony. That's, parenthetically, I find this fascinating. C. Henry Gordon was originally cast as Travis in that film, and when Victor Jory became available, they decided they'd rather have him, so they just moved him over to Santa Ana. So, Santa Ana, Travis, what's the diff, right? Santa Ana is usually just a figurehead. He's sometimes cruel, and almost always a brilliant tactician, but also usually fairly cowardly because, of course, we always see him running in the movies. And he's also a little horny as well. And that's because of Emily Morgan. Now, we all know who Emily Morgan is or is supposed to be. According to legend, Emily was, shall we say, distracting Santa Ana to give Sam Houston time to take him by surprise. Whether or not this is true, the movies have, of course, brought it up several times. The interesting thing is that the movies never identify her. I think she shows up in 4, maybe 5 different films, and she's never identified as a character. She's always just a background figure. Although, as you will see, in at least one case, her figure is very much in the foreground. She's just there. It's as though the filmmakers know that the audience will say, "Oh, Emily Morgan. We know exactly who that is." But maybe audiences don't know who she is because little by little, the legendary way of looking at these events seems to be dying out, and maybe until she is or is not proven to have been there and done that, maybe she'll start slipping from the public consciousness. Just as I have a nephew who just graduated from college, and he had never heard that George Washington cut down a cherry tree. He had never heard it. These sort of things boggle my mind. But what I did was, this is the tape that's on the edge right there. Yeah, queued up. What I did was I took the 6 surviving films about San Jacinto, and this lasted about 7 minutes, so I hope you will find it interesting. And I edited them in a kind of montage that will show you, I think, many different ways of going through this battle.
Smith. It's going to be a good day to fight a battle.
Gentlemen, this 21st day of April will someday go down in history as either the beginning or the end of Texas independence. I give you one thought to take with you across the open space and into the camp of Santa Ana. Remember the Alamo.
Trust in God and fear not. Victory is certain. Remember Goliad. Remember the Alamo. All right, boys. Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad!
They must not leave the field! Think of the fate of your loved ones if we are unsuccessful this afternoon.
We will not be.
If you are faint at heart at what we must do, you must remember the Alamo Let that be your cry. Let that be your cry. Let that be your cry. Remember the Alamo. Remember the Alamo.
Forward! find me the dictator. I don't want him alive. Go on, find him. Vámonos, hombres.
The guy who drops down at the, thanks. The man who dies raising the flag, the Lone Star flag over the battlefield of San Jacinto, is the great Gabby Hayes. God bless him. What greater hero could Gabby have been to give his life? As you can see, the movies flirt with history. They dodge in and out. There are bits and pieces of reality that come through. There are enormous bloopers, historical bloopers that make it in. 1939 Man of Conquest, which is a heck of a battle, I think, but completely non-realistic. And I think in Hollywood terms, they would think they came out the better because of that. But as I say, we don't go to movies to learn history. We go to movies to catch glimpses or maybe to peer through a little piece of window into history. History is what happened in the past, but it's also a dream that we dream. There's nothing wrong with singing songs of heroes, even if they're slightly inauthentic. I think a lot of us became interested in the Alamo because of Fess Parker and John Wayne, neither of whom brought anything authentic to the mix at all, and yet it gave us passion for it. And I think that's one thing that movies can do. They can make history come alive in a specific way that makes it live in our emotions and in our hearts as well as our minds. And I'll be happy to answer any questions with my colleagues, and I thank you very much for your attention.
I want to thank Frank. That was an outstanding collage there of movies. We have about 20 minutes or so, and I'd like to ask our speakers to come up. I think Miguel may have to be heading back to the airport, so unfortunately he will not be able to join us here. But I would like to, Nadia, would you like to? Yeah, why don't you? I'm going to call on Nina Hindi.
I just want to thank our speakers for the job that they've done. They have given us their entire weekend and come from all over the world, literally, and we just thank you for that. And we've got just a small token of appreciation for what you've done for us. Miguel? Frank? And it's a Texas Star, appropriately, and it says San Jacinto Symposium with today's date. And thank you, guys. Thank you. And just before they do their questions, I would like to thank each of you for coming and participating today, and just for your love of our state and our history. It's made it a great day. So thanks, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff, for all you've done.
Okay, here's your chance. You can talk to the scholars up here and ask questions.
I have a question for Frank.
Okay, go ahead.
Frank, what's the earliest movie that shows a woman in the tent?
1950, Martyrs of the Alamo, which you saw a little bit of, has 6 women in it.
6 women, no, but I mean a yellow rose in the tent. What's the first movie earliest movie that shows a woman in the tent.
The first time you'll see that is Gone to Texas, as far as I know.
And the date?
1986.
Right. My thesis, and Jeff is a fellow expert on this, is that nobody knew about the woman in the tent unless they had been to the Newberry Library in Chicago until 1956, when the Bollard manuscripts were published by the University of Oklahoma Press. I challenge anyone to show me anything in print, not your memory, anything in print about the Yellow Rose of Texas and the woman in the tent before 1956. I'll give you $100. How do you explain the 6 women in the tent? That doesn't have anything to do with the Yellow Rose of Texas. That has to do with the word horny that you mentioned earlier. And we know about Santa Anna's alleged fake marriage with the woman, the young girl in San Antonio while he was there. There was no dearth of stories about Santa Anna's womanizing. But the question of the woman in the tent, her name was Emily D. West. She's from New Haven, Connecticut. She almost certainly shows up in the 1830 census in New Haven in the home of Simeon D. Jocelyn. And Simeon D. Jocelyn, in the document that Jeff found, signed her contract to go to Texas to work for James Morgan in 1835 in New York City. And Simeon D. Jocelyn was one of the Amistad Committee later on if you've seen the film Amistad, he's one of the men who helped hire Roger Baldwin. He was a philanthropist eager to help free blacks. And Emily D. West was a free woman of color, and one of the artillery captains, Isaac Moreland at San Jacinto, testified as a judge of Harris County that she lost her free papers at San Jacinto in April of '36. So she's really there. William Bollard was a British traveler in the Texas Republic. He has some of the most extensive manuscripts and drawings ever done with regard to the Texas Republic. They're in the Newberry Library in Chicago. I think Joe B. France once said that you can divide, before they were published, you could divide Texas historians into those who had seen the Bollard manuscripts and those who haven't. And most of them certainly hadn't. And Eugene Holland, University of Oklahoma Press, 1956, and a paperback reprint not too many years ago. But that's the only, I repeat, the only source of the woman in the tent. I'm sorry, it's not the Newberry Press, it's the Newberry Library in Chicago. That's where the manuscripts are held. And the University of Oklahoma Press published the Eugene Holland edited papers. And that's the only place where that story has ever appeared. And I need, since Madge is out there, my graduate student Jim Lutzweiler discovered in 1998, 97 or 98, the source of the story, that is, who told the story to Bollard. And the way he found it was to go to the Newberry Library, find that sheet of paper, and discover what even the late lamented Margaret Sweat Henson did not find, because she used a Xerox. And that is that the paper telling the story of the Yellow Rose of Texas had been cut out of another piece of paper and pasted on. And it was written private on the side. And it took Jim Lutzweiler 3 trips to Chicago from North Carolina. But he finally found, after going through the thousands and thousands of pages of the Bollard manuscripts, the page from which it had been cut. And on that page, it identified the veteran of San Jacinto that told Bollard the story. And it was General Houston in 1842. Now think about this. He's the most important man in Texas, and he knows her name, who she worked for, her racial status, and that she was at the battle. And that's a pretty remarkable story. And the fact that she was there at the battle has been documented with her passport application to leave the Texas Republic in 1837. I'm going to dump on Steve Harden one more time. I called Steve the night before last to tell him I was going to dump on him and to tell him he better get here to defend himself, but he has to teach, and I know that is a responsibility he takes seriously. But when he published Texian Iliad, Steve said that there was not a scintilla of evidence that there was any truth to the story of the woman in the tent at San Jacinto. Well, we have 7 documents now, and if each one of them is a scintilla, I think that's scintillating evidence that the woman was there, probably in the tent. You mean Swartwout? He said he's, okay, the question was, what about the document about Morgan sending Santa Anna's tent? I believe he sent it to Samuel Swartwout. Samuel Swartwout was mentioned earlier by Miguel. He was one of those Jacksonian cronies who was himself on the take. He's the first man to swindle $1 million in the history of the United States. And he was the collector at the Port of New York, the customs collector at the Port of New York. And Morgan said that he was sending him Santa Anna's tent, and I think Swartwout said that he had put it in the museum, and we never found out what happened to that tent. It's disappeared from history. In that letter, he doesn't say anything at all about it. I don't think Morgan knew about the story. Let me tell you, do I have time to tell you 5 more minutes of stuff on this? Because I think San Jacinto people are kind of interested in this. The key, the link, is Isaac Moreland. Isaac Moreland, who was the Harris County judge who signed Emily West's passport application in 1837, the artillery commander. Ms. Roberts' first volume of the correspondence between Sam Houston and his wife has these letters talking about Isaac Moreland in 1842. He's on his deathbed, and Sam Houston goes and visits with him on his deathbed. And then a few weeks later, he preaches the eulogy and is a pallbearer at Moreland's funeral. And a few weeks after that, he tells the story to William Ballard. And I think that it's, if there's any truth to the story, let's have a hand for Miguel Soto. Adios. Isaac, the story seems to have gone from Emily Morgan to Isaac Moreland, who was familiar with her and who spoke for her in 1837, to Sam Houston in 1842, to Ballard. Despite what Margaret said in her entry on Emily D. West in the handbook, she's wrong. This is not a story that was told around the campfires of Texas. If anyone had known the story about the woman in the tent, then when Sam Houston ran for re-election in 1841, it would have been all over every place, because he had so many enemies, as some of you well know. He had so many enemies that anyone who had a story that would detract from his generalship at San Jacinto would have put that story in the public record. And the fact that in this bitter campaign in 1841, not a soul mentioned anything about a woman in the tent convinces me that it's not until 1956 that this becomes public. And that's amazing, because if you go to San Antonio today, you look at that hotel that used to be the Medical Arts Building, and that's the Emily Morgan Hotel. This is a modern legend. And one of the things my graduate students have been doing is tracing the development of that legend. Almost everything you've read about Emily, if it's personal information, it's false because we don't know. And I'll tell you some other time what we do know about her, but it's not very much. Is that right? The P.T. Barnum Museum? That's good to know, thanks. Has he published that? After being destroyed by fire? Even academic historians don't push it that far.
Yes.
I don't want to overstep my bounds, but I can tell you that from what I understand, there has been an archaeologist hired to help come up with a master plan for the future archaeology at San Jacinto. And I've talked to the gentleman, and he seems really nice, and I'm very impressed with him, and I think that he's going to be the right man for the job. So it's being addressed, and boy, I don't have any pull, but I'm sure trying to encourage anybody I know that certainly is something that needs to be done, and just to me has all kinds of potential. I could tell him, but I'd have to kill him after that.
And the Sam Elliott film, it was aired as Houston, the Legend of Texas, but it's on video now as Gone to Texas. And it is available on video as far as I know.
Okay, you will answer that, Greg.
If you were going on Highway 59 southwest out of Houston, and you got into Fort Bend County almost all the way through it, there's a little old speed trap called Kendleton. Famous speed trap, which, by the way, is apparently not a speed trap anymore, but I still don't trust them. At that little town, right before you get into it, there's Turkey Creek. And Mrs. Powell's was just on the east side of Turkey Creek, probably about 3/4 of a mile south. It's on private property, but there's a marker there. And my understanding is that any Texas citizen has the right to go to a marker. You can't go there and dig, but you can go there. Southwest towards Victoria. If you're going out of Houston towards Victoria on 59, about, 30 miles, 35 miles outside from here, on the other side of Richmond-Rosenberg, is the little town of Kendleton, and you'll come to Turkey Creek. It's just off that creek. Yeah.
Dr. Dimmick, how do you explain some of the artifacts at the Urea site across Turkey Creek? Why would there be so much there? And if you could tell everybody how wide you think the path through the sea of mud is going to end up being and how long it is.
Okay. A couple of interesting things. Okay, first of all, he asked me about the Urea site. Why do I think there was so much there? That's a very interesting site. I went back and took the San Luis log, their daily report. They were with Urea at the time. And I tried to decide where they camped each night. And they didn't camp on that creek. They did not camp on the West Bernard. So my theory is that is a site that they crossed, did not camp, and it's interesting because we are not finding the artifacts there, the same type of artifacts that we find at a campsite. I don't think they camped there. I think they were waiting to cross, and I think somebody dumped a bunch of trash. Honestly, it's in a very small area, and it has been farmed since, so it's been spread out a little bit, but it's amazing how many gun pieces we've found there. We found all kinds of pieces of butt plates and side plates, but they're all broken. There's nothing whole. And it looks to me like what they did is just dump some trash there in a very small area. So it's technically not a campsite. And your other question is a very interesting question. How wide is the trail through the Mar de Lodo and how long is it? We've been able to trail them for about 4 miles, 4 to 5 miles through those rice fields before we finally lost them. Just like De La Peña says, the trail starts out very narrow and it gets really wide. By where we lost them, they're really spread out. And De La Peña says that they had to get off the road because everything was stuck. So he said the units became almost individual units. Filosola, to me, said it best. He said there were these little elevations of land out in the middle of this swamp. And he said they had to unload the mules. He said, first of all, when the mules were in the mud, the only thing that kept the mules from sinking was the cargo on their back. So the cargo was like a life jacket to the mules. He said they would take the cargo off and haul it on their shoulders to these little elevations of land, and he said then they would basically carry the mules to these elevations of land. It's the only way they could get the mules, so the Mexican soldiers halfway carried those mules. He's asking me if that hollow brass item could have been the tip of a walking stick. It certainly could be. To me, it looks a little thicker than I would have thought, but that doesn't mean it wasn't. And it does look worn at that end, so that's certainly a possibility. Relatively close, yes. I'd say 30 yards from each other.